Hi everybody and welcome to FWD's third Sustainability Forum session. 3Keel are back and we are kicking off this year's forums with decarbonising logistics. This session will be recorded like all of our previous and will be available to you, and we'll make sure that those links are circulated so you can send them out to your colleagues and refer back as well. Before we kick off, just a point on questions. We really welcome the interactive element of these sessions. And also it's a bonus for watching it live is that you get to ask the experts. So today's webinar is in sections. At the end of each section, we'll pause for questions. If a question comes to you, you don't want it flying out of your head, like often I find questions do with me, you can pop them in the chat or simply just say you've got the question in the chat and we'll come to you individually and we'll keep an eye on it. But without further ado, I will hand you over to Emily Crowe and Alwyn Smith from 3Keel, now some familiar faces and very much part of the FWD family. Many thanks. Take it away.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us back again for another session. If I just move us along to the next slide, we'll find an introduction of the content we'll cover today and go through some of the aims of the session. So Lindsay's already covered off the housekeeping points. As she mentioned, this will be recorded and available afterwards. And please do ask questions at the end of each section if they come to you. It'd be great to have a bit of discussion. So moving on to the aims of today, we're focusing on logistics, with hopefully achieving these four. So building understanding of where logistics occur within the wholesale value chain. Secondly, exploring some options for decarbonisation of these sources, and then kind of assessing the relative advantages and limitations of each. Thirdly, providing wholesalers with some practical guidance on how to implement these actions within your own operations. And finally, we've got some information on kind of market trends in the sector and highlighting some innovation and best practice, and that will include a bit of an overview of the policy as well. As Lindsay said, this is the third of kind of 4 FWD member webinars in this session, and we've been diving into so a deeper dive into some of the key sources of emissions that came out of the roadmap development. So the first forum we had was on kind of a recap of the roadmap. The previous one was depots, today is logistics, and then upcoming for the 4th session, we will have a focus on the cold chain. And then the plan is to kind of keep going on into the future and expand the scope slightly into supply chain emissions as well. So for now, we're focusing on the most direct. In terms of the agenda for today, the agenda quite closely mirrors those 4 aims. So starting off with looking at the carbon footprint specifically, and then moving into methods of decarbonisation, including some recommendations of use cases, as well as those advantages and limitations I mentioned. Thirdly, looking at the implementation side, an outlining of different support that's available, tailoring options depending on the structure of your logistics network and also your method of procurement. And then finally passing on to Alwyn, who will go through some of the policy and market trends before wrapping up with a summary and maybe some extra time for Q&A at the end. So we'll see how we get on there. Delivering the session today will be Alwyn and I. We work for a company called 3Keel, which hopefully is familiar to some of you now. May recognise me from the FWD Awards prior to Christmas. I got a bit of a grilling from Tom Allen. So the name might be familiar, but we just thought we'd add a bit of context regarding who we are before we get into the content. 3Keel are sustainability advisors, and we're specialised in working in the food system and within supply chain and landscape specifically. And the graphic on this slide just provides a bit of an overview of the breadth of work that 3Keel does with expertise across a number of sustainability topic areas, mainly focusing within the food system. In this graphic here, Alwyn and I both work in the climate change practice area, which is this one here, which really focuses on carbon and climate specifically. I work as a senior consultant and have been with the company for about 4 years, or coming up to 4 years. And within that time, I've worked on a range of projects focusing on carbon accounting, carbon reduction, target setting, and climate risk. I've also been working with FWD for just over 2 years now, and we started that journey off with the net zero roadmap in 2023 and carrying on through these forums. So I'll just quickly pass over to Alwyn to introduce herself before we get into the content.
Yes, thank you. Just trying to find the unmute button. Thanks, Emily. So yeah, I'm Alwyn Smith. I'm a principal consultant here at 3Keel. I lead our main climate change delivery team, and similar to Emily, work on quite climate and carbon focused projects. Was also involved in the roadmap development with FWD a while back, and yeah, I've been really enjoying these forums and getting to bring the content of that roadmap to life since.
Brilliant. So starting off with a couple of slides to set the scene and understand what is driving the logistics portion of wholesale's carbon footprint. We're starting off by returning back to one of the most prevalent graphics within the FWD net zero roadmap, which is this chart. And it's a chart that we've returned back to within each of the forums and presentations we've done, just to contextualize the conversation and the topic for today. So it breaks down the wholesale supply chain into its core components and visualizes in these yellow bubbles the size of the emissions produced by each one. And logistics emissions are slightly different to some other sources in the sense that they actually occur in a couple of different ways within the supply chain. So the first area you might see vehicle emissions is in what we would consider to be scope 1. And scope 1 relates to all of your company's direct operations. And that would be through fuel purchased for vehicles that you own or operate. And that's this within this donut up here. As you can see, the vehicle fuel use is 63% of the wholesale's direct emissions. So by far the most significant portion of your own operations. And that will really be the focus of today's session. But logistics emissions also occur within this column here, the upstream transport, and that relates to any transportation of the products that occurs prior to you, the wholesaler, obtaining it, but also any kind of third-party logistics that you procure as well will come up within this column, within this bracket here. It might look small, 0.3, but that 0.3 actually equates to 300,000 tons of CO2. So it might be the smallest on this table, but it's definitely not small. So definitely still something that shouldn't be overlooked. And we'll kind of be thinking about these two in combination today. Moving on from the where to the what. Transport emissions are created through the conversion of fossil fuels into energy, typically through a combustion engine, and that releases greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So that's really the core of the emission source. There are also some emissions associated with the production of the vehicles themselves, but the primary output and the focus of today is through the power of the vehicle itself. And there are a number of different factors that might influence how significant these emissions from transport can be. And we've kind of grouped them on the slide a little bit here. So firstly, the mode of transport can be heavily influential. So for instance, air travel, air freight is considerably more intensive than sea freight. Although given the context of today's conversation, we'll be primarily focusing on road emissions, as that's the primary source of logistics in the UK wholesale supply chain. Then moving on to this second list here, the fuel source can also be a key driver of emissions, but that also represents one of the main levers for emissions reduction. So road vehicles can be powered by a range of different sources, from traditional fossil fuels, such as petrol and diesel, to biofuels, for example, hydro-treated vegetable oil, or HVO for short, or electricity. And then there are also a couple of additional factors that are definitely worth considering, because they can also influence emissions, and that can be the vehicle type, the network efficiency, so the distance and frequency of journeys, the vehicle efficiency, and also whether the vehicle is refrigerated or not can increase the emissions. But as I said earlier, refrigeration is going to be covered in the next session, so we're just going to kind of park that one today, but it does kind of feature in transport emissions. So very quick recap of transport emissions. Any initial questions on that before we get into the methods? Okay, great. I can't hear any pinging us, so hopefully that means there's no questions just yet.
Yeah, nothing in the chat so far, Emily.
Okay, fab. Great. So let's move on to how we can start looking at reducing these emissions. We're going to consider 4 methods of decarbonisation today. We're going to do a bit of an explanation and evaluation of each. The first looks at optimizing logistics efficiency. And then the following 3 are more focused on the methods of powering the vehicles, so electric vehicles, biofuels, and hydrogen. So we'll start off with the optimizing efficiency. How does it work? It basically involves strategies to reduce emissions through better logistics management, and that can include a whole host of tools and methods. So route optimization is a very common one, also load consolidation, how full the vehicle is, fuel efficiency improvements and network changes. It can also include things like training, driver training. So there's lots of different ways to optimize the efficiency depending on the specific makeup and structure of your business. Some advantages are it's cost effective. This is one of those great reduction initiatives that reduces carbon and reduces costs. So it's a bit of a win-win because the efficiency measures often reduce the fuel consumption, which enables kind of that double saving and doesn't require any large capital investments. It's quick to implement. Improvements can be made relatively quickly as it doesn't require significant investment in infrastructure. So there's no real time lag there for implementation. And it's also quite flexible. You can apply it to all different types of fleets, regardless of the fuel type or the vehicle model. Because there's a wide range of options there that kind of become part of this package of efficiency. There's something that can fit into any kind of business or network. But there are also some limitations, and the primary one is that there is a limited reduction potential for the carbon savings. And that's because the method of power generation, which is the key source of emissions, isn't really being altered through this. So it's unlikely that efficiency alone will help to achieve more ambitious emissions targets. Also, it suffers from diminishing returns once you've achieved those initial efficiencies and seen some progress. Once you kind of tick them off, it's kind of unlikely to keep reducing down over time. Once you've optimized all the areas that are available to you, any kind of further improvements might be relatively incremental. And thirdly, it does require reliable data, which means regular data collection and implementation of analysis tools. It also, as with all of these, will need some management oversight to be the most effective. So there may be some investment in specific software tools. So in terms of the use case, it's definitely something that can and should be used by companies of all sizes and nature, and probably something that is already being done by most businesses, probably, given that kind of cost element as well. But companies with larger budgets could also invest in kind of more integrated fleet management systems or more sophisticated software. But then small organizations, there is also opportunities to do in-house analysis and deploy methods such as the driver training courses, which require less kind of technical expertise, but can also have a real impact on the footprint. So depending on the method of logistics procurement, you may need to collaborate with third-party logistics providers on this, but we do have a bit more on the collaboration side of things later in the session. So we'll touch on that a bit more later. Secondly, we've got electric vehicles. Electrification essentially replaces the fossil fuel element in this case, and electricity is the means of powering the vehicle. They're powered by batteries using electric motors rather than internal combustion engines. So because of that, the main advantage is that it's a highly effective method of carbon reduction. EVs have zero kind of what we would call tailpipe emissions, which means that no carbon is produced by operating them. No emissions are coming out of the tailpipe of the vehicle, more literally. So this can be, and actually that can be further reduced if the electricity being put into the vehicle is generated from a renewable source. So there's the opportunity to not only reduce the tailpipe emissions, but also the generation emissions as well. So that can be quite a good compounded saving. They're also typically quite low cost to operate because electricity is cheaper than diesel. And in particular, as I said, if it's generated using on-site renewables, it's even cheaper again, and relatively low maintenance costs as well. The third advantage is that it's compliant with kind of policy requirements, and it contributes to our national net zero targets, which means it's not at risk of any kind of taxes or fines. For instance, it's ULEZ compliant. So any new policy that's brought in that's aligned with net zero, you won't kind of suffer from penalization from that side of things. A couple of limitations that do currently exist when it comes to electric vehicles. The range is one that is very common. There's a limited range in a lot of the electric vehicles available at the moment, particularly when you were looking at the kind of HGV long haul side of things. There's also a more limited charging infrastructure. Access to charging stations can vary drastically depending on where you are operating in the country. So depending on where you are, this might be a limitation or it may not. Also, it does require quite a significant initial investment. So despite there being longer term fuel savings, there is a relatively high upfront cost to EVs. And finally, the kind of increased time of refueling, because you have to wait for the battery to recharge rather than just adding more fuel into the vehicle. It kind of might require a bit of a restructuring in terms of the approach to delivery schedules and routes and that sort of thing to incorporate that extra time lag. However, I do want to mention that a lot of these limitations are expected to be mitigated as time goes on with increased rolling out of charge infrastructure and more innovation into the battery technology. There's something that are kind of being actively tackled at the moment. So with that in mind, when we look at the use case, long term, EVs are expected to be the primary mode of power generation in a net zero world that we're all aiming for, particularly when it comes to road transportation. However, currently, I would say like the most common uses are for more like urban or local journeys, which comprise of short routes and like frequent repetition along like a predictable route. So you can map out that infrastructure or invest in infrastructure that is going to be heavily used by your network in order to make it more feasible. Thirdly, moving on to biofuels. So biofuels can be biodiesel or HVO, as I mentioned earlier. They are a renewable fuel that's produced from organic material. There's kind of two main avenues to producing biofuels. They can either be created from like a virgin biomass or from waste. And from a sustainability perspective, there is quite a considerable difference between the two. It's called what we would call a feedstock, what is used to create the biofuels. And so we'll get into that a little bit more when I get onto the limitations. But they're considered to be a lower emission than fossil fuels because the biomass is a renewable resource and it's a much shorter growing period in relation to fossil fuels, for instance, which are finite. So in terms of the advantages, it's quite an immediate solution. It's typically seen as sometimes to be a transitional solution because they're very compatible with most existing diesel vehicles, and they don't really require any major changes to the infrastructure, which means, again, there's like not very much time delay to implementation. And leading on from that, they're also quite scalable because they can be blended with these traditional fuels. You can roll them out kind of quite broadly because they don't need to be 100% swap. And finally, there's the opportunity to retain the vehicles that you've got. So because they can be put into traditional internal combustion engines, it doesn't require that significant investment that something like electric vehicles does, because you can retain the same vehicles that you're currently using. However, for the limitations, some of them are quite significant and definitely shouldn't be overlooked because there's a bit of a conflict, I suppose, when it comes to biofuels. And the main one is the competition for the feedstock. So increasing demand for biofuels would then increase additional competition for agricultural products because could be the same crop potentially that is being diverted away from food production and onto energy production. So there's a bit of a social issue there because it can create a risk to the food supply, but also primarily because there's this increased demand, it can then also lead to increased demand for land conversion, and the rate of land conversion or deforestation could be increased through people wishing to change their fuel source to biofuels. And land conversion and deforestation in itself is a huge source of emissions. So that kind of calls into question whether using these biofuels, if they're from a virgin material, is actually reducing overall emissions when you view it more holistically. And the kind of opaqueness of the biofuel supply chain doesn't help this either, because it's quite difficult to know for certain whether you're purchasing a biofuel that has been produced off this recently deforested land, or whether it's historically farmed land, or even better, whether it's from waste. So the choice of the feedstock is really the key driver as to how sustainable a biofuel may or may not be. And because of that, there's a limited availability. If we take kind of the best case, which is waste or biofuel that's produced from waste oil, it's not as widely available as, well, A, conventional diesel, or B, wider biofuels that don't have that traceable element. So the chance that your demand for fuel is equal to the waste biofuel that you can access is relatively limited. And because of that, there's variable emission savings. So as I said, depending on the source of your feedstock, you could achieve really significant emission savings, or they could be less so, depending on how you've sourced that fuel. And then finally, it's not a net zero solution. So unlike electric vehicles or hydrogen, using biofuels does still produce carbon through the internal combustion engine. So we still see those tailpipe emissions, the kind of flip side of the coin of, yes, they can go into your current vehicles and they're compatible with diesel, is the flip side of that is that they're not completely net zero in the sense that emissions are still being generated through their use. So bringing all that together into the use case, biofuels can widely be viewed as a temporary transitional solution in some cases where it's expected that it will be a long time before any other alternative is available. However, with the pinch of salt with that is to kind of investigate the traceability, to investigate the origins of your biofuels that you're interested in procuring. And ideally, if you can shorten the supply chain and use waste oils that might arise out of your own system, that's kind of the most guaranteed way that what the biofuel that you're using is actually from waste and not from any kind of virgin material. So I think, for instance, McDonald's do this with their waste cooking oil. They use it as a biofuel because it's that closed loop recycling system, which means it's much, much better for traceability. And finally, hydrogen. So hydrogen works by, it powers vehicles using a hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle. And that basically means that the method of electricity production is via hydrogen rather than a battery. And because it removes that reliance on the battery, it kind of unlocks that longer distance capability. And that's one of the kind of key advantages of hydrogen, that you don't have to rely on that battery for power. So you can cover more distances before you require refueling. And because of that, because you have a fuel source rather than a battery, you have much faster refueling times. And finally, you can still achieve that significantly high emission saving because the hydrogen is produced renewably and then it's powering an electric vehicle. So you don't have any fossil fuel in the system at all. However, there are still some significant limitations to hydrogen. It's quite like a new and emerging technology. So there is a significant lack of infrastructure. There's currently like very few commercial options available to invest in hydrogen vehicles. And when those options are available, they're very expensive. So there's very high cost of both implementation and of operation. So the significant investment is high to install all the infrastructure required to run a hydrogen vehicle. And also there's a very high cost of operation as a fuel in general. It's currently a lot more expensive than petrol or diesel, which also just adds to that overall financial picture of it being quite a significant limitation. So when that comes to recommending a use case for hydrogen, we've actually just drawn out the use case on a separate slide. So it's quite a lot to take in here, but we'll break it down. So this slide contains a graph created by Michael Liebrick, who's he's a leader in the clean energy field. And the graph essentially applies the concept of the energy efficiency rating system to evaluate the use case for hydrogen. And the uses which relate to land transport specifically in this slide have been drawn out in those colors. So the land uses are kind of colored by the efficiency rating that they fall within, just to make it a bit clearer there on the slide. And the reason Michael created this ranking was he wanted to kind of try and view hydrogen more holistically as part of wider global decarbonisation, to take into account more factors than just carbon, but also like price, safety, the complexity of implementation, and also convenience, what kind of makes the most sense. And this view, particularly for hydrogen, is essential because it's likely that even in the longer term, there's going to be a relatively limited supply of hydrogen in the general economy. And so viewing it in like land transportation in relation to its other uses is really important to kind of make that evaluation of where it should be best deployed. And from the ladder, we can see quite clearly that majority of land transportation is ranked at the bottom. So on that bottom level of G, we've got like urban delivery, and then in F, there's regional trucks. And the highest one that relates to wholesale is probably D, and that's long distance trucks and coaches, but even that is still really only halfway up the ladder. So this kind of shows how hydrogen is most likely unfeasible for the majority of wholesale journeys. This picture is obviously may change, but when we look at it kind of, as I said, holistically within the wider economy and that prioritization of hydrogen uses, road transportation doesn't come up super high. And so we kind of recommend looking elsewhere before visiting the the hydrogen option. And furthermore, so when you take hydrogen and you evaluate it alongside other sources of low carbon logistics, that kind of point is further confirmed. Here we have a table just evaluating those key elements that we've touched upon within the advantages and limitations of each of the 4 logistic solutions that we've considered in this section, taking into account we've got the decarbonisation potential, average distance, costs of running and implementation, ease of implementation, and technological readiness. So you can clearly see that hydrogen is scoring kind of high or challenging for a lot of these in comparison to some of the other options, which are a bit more feasible or a bit more approachable. The decarbonisation potential is highest for electric freight and hydrogen, but there definitely are still savings to be made from optimization, particularly, and also biofuels, as I said, as that transitional fuel in some use cases. So out of this graph, we can kind of see that electric freight, even though it's not low cost yet, as I said, a lot of the implementation limitations that are existing at the moment are kind of being worked upon, which is why you have that kind of trade-off of biofuels as temporary and electric freight as the long-term decarbonisation strategy. So before we move on to the implementation side of things within the business, any questions?
There is a question here from Kath, 2 questions actually in the chat, and I'm happy to take the first one. It follows on very nicely from the comment you've just made about electric vehicles and implementation challenges. So she's asking if there's any view on whether the government are looking at grid infrastructure and the ability to provide electricity for EV charging. I do have a bit of a section on policy later, but just to answer this question more specifically, I think in short, yes, there's an office for electric vehicles, and they released a policy position paper just in December, and it's specifically looking at improving grid connections with the view to enabling more efficient and easy EV charging. So it outlines basically this paper, the key actions that need to take place from government, but also from other stakeholders that are operating in that space. And it kind of loops into the Clean Power 2030 action plan, which the government released in December last year as well, which is kind of more broadly, not specifically focused on logistics or freight, but looking at the power and the grid across the country more broadly. But obviously, if there's going to be increasing demand for electricity from electrification of vehicles, it's going to be crucial that the grid is expanding to meet that need, and particularly the connection point, which we know has been a key barrier and blocker. The second question is around size. What size would be appropriate for EVs? I mean, I'm not a deep expert on different logistics vehicle types, but I know basically as it stands, kind of cars and small vans can be electrified up to a reasonable range, and HGVs is where the challenge is. But just to give a concrete example, we'll speak to this in one of the case studies later, but there are currently pilots and on the road HGVs that have ranges of between 300 and 500 kilometers, and that's a fully fledged kind of 18-wheelers. But I think they're kind of some of the more expensive and less available vehicles as it stands, whereas kind of car and van sized tend to be electrified more easily already today at a reasonable cost. So Emily, back over to you.
Thank you. That actually tees me up quite nicely for the next slide, which outlines kind of the different factors and questions that you may want to ask of your operations when trying to decide which of these low carbon logistics solutions is right for you. Particularly kind of as a first step. Obviously, we've already said that like long term, the idea is to move to EVs across the board, but because there are these barriers that are in place at the moment, a lot of these can kind of be disaggregated through some of these questions. So we've put a bit of a flow chart up here to kind of provide a bit of an overview of how you might work through some of them and to try and work out which solution is most appropriate for you. So starting off with thinking about the ownership structure, whether you own, rent your vehicles or use a third-party logistics provider. You have kind of different degrees of control and operational control that you might be able to implement depending on how you source your logistics, which then obviously has a knock-on effect on how you reduce those emissions. So if we just kind of follow through the owned arm for now and say that your vehicles are owned, and are you able to install charge points on site, and that has links back to our previous forum on depots, and again whether depots are owned or rented, and also things to do with like local planning, access and road access and access to the grid and all of those considerations as well. So if you are able to install them, thinking about next about the geographic scale, whether you kind of tend to deploy regionally or wider long haul nationally, that mainly dictates, I suppose, the size of vehicle that you might be interested in investing in. And so for both of those options, we've put electric, whether it's a van or an HGV, with just a bit of a note that may be thinking about that interim solution of biofuels if it's kind of sustainable for your company. If that route isn't available, again, what if you can't install charge points in site, what environment do you operate within? Similar to geographic scale, but more specifically looking at that urban rural component. If it's urban, is there other networks that you can draw upon? Can you use local infrastructure or public charging points as the basis to refuel your vehicles? Or if it's more rural and that's a kind of a longer term plan, you might need to look at sustainable biofuels in the short term. And then when it comes to kind of rented vehicles or third party logistics, it's a slightly different approach. First of all, for rented, kind of clarifying whether you have control over the vehicle or fuel type. So if you rent the vehicles, but you have what we consider to be operational control, so you make the calls over all of the operational aspects of the vehicles, you can then pop up into that kind of more owned arm of the flowchart. But if not, you're looking at more similar approaches to a wholesaler that might procure from third-party logistics, and that's to do with like contract length. If it's a long-term partner, you can take a more of a collaborative approach with working more actively and proactively with them in helping them achieve their goals of greening their fleet. And if it's short-term or temporary, then looking for those providers that have this kind of decarbonisation front of mind and have a policy and a strategy to reduce their carbon emissions and greening their fleet that way. So you can align with them and help them achieve those goals as well. And so in able to do a lot of these actions and be successful in your implementation, we need to ensure that detailed logistics data is being collected. And again, the type of data that you collect or that might be available for you to collect can differ depending on the ownership model or the procurement model. So for instance, if you are able to collect a lot more specific information for owned vehicles, then that's great. But if you're using third-party logistics, you may be searching for data that's a little bit more focused on their governance and strategy. Some of this data that we're talking about may be vehicle specific, so the fuel type, consumption, its efficiency, the model, and also if it's refrigerated, whether it complies with any current emissions standards such as the Euro 6 compliance. Also looking to the operational side of things to deliver those optimization efficiency points, collecting any current efficiency metrics like the load factor, delivery frequency, etc., route data. And then as you go down this list, and you can see from the ticks on the right-hand side, it kind of moves slightly to the right. We're moving on to more kind of operational into governance. So whether there's third-party certifications or initiatives that they're members of that kind of signal their intent to decarbonize the fleet, if they have a published roadmap that you can kind of align to and has targets within that they're hoping to achieve, that can kind of contribute to your logistics strategy as well. But overall, kind of, unless you own your vehicles, there will be a degree of collaboration that's required. And also, we would kind of recommend, in general, like collecting as much information as possible, because even though you may be able to collect enough information to calculate your emissions, for instance, you only need fuel data really to calculate your emissions, but that doesn't kind of give the transparency of how or why those emissions are occurring. And if you want to kind of identify those main levers of reduction for your business specifically, you will need some of this more detailed information to do with, if it's refrigerated, the load factor, route data, all of that kind of wider data collection beyond just the fuel consumption can really be super beneficial when it comes to identifying those drivers and building that into a plan to decarbonize. For those that do source from third-party logistics, this is quite an interesting graph, which when providers were surveyed and asked which of the following kind of options that are listed there, I appreciate they're quite small, so I'll read them out to you. But which of the following would encourage your company to cut carbon emissions? Customers willing to pay a premium and also customers willing to go in with longer contracts scored very highly. They're those top two bars that are highlighted in that first orange box, as that enables companies to kind of finance investments more securely and set up new infrastructure, because reduces their degree of risk that they might not be able to deliver on that. And then another category that also scored quite highly is that second box down, and that's kind of the government offering more tax incentives or subsidies, which does also align with kind of wholesale sector, like wider policy advocacy position. So this graph provides some really useful insights into kind of how wholesalers can collaborate with the third-party logistics providers to achieve that mutual emissions reductions. More generally, collaboration continues to be critical. This is a theme that has come up in all of our forums and is likely to keep coming up because it is so critical, especially when we're starting to think about emissions that are occurring within the supply chain rather than just direct operations. So that might be collaboration with customers, and that might involve sharing data and exploring options to co-fund, or it could be with the electricity suppliers, particularly as we're looking to move to electric vehicles and sorry, your electricity demand might increase. So collecting usage data and also price data using metering can maximize your kind of efficiency with renewable electricity and use it at the most economical times. So it kind of contributes to feeding into that more kind of efficient strategy. Thirdly, with the third-party logistics providers, as we've just mentioned, kind of trying to collect some of those data points that was on the slide before last. And finally, with local government and research bodies participating in pilot schemes and helping kind of aid innovation with scaling up of the infrastructure and sending those signals to local government so that it kind of promotes the investment on the policy side as well. But on that note, some of the examples of support that's currently available, and this is probably mainly applies to fleets that are owned, but potentially not exclusively. There's a number of funding options available. We've just highlighted two here. And as Olwen said, she'll cover some of the kind of headline policies in the following section. But this slide just outlines two of those examples. One is a plug-in van and truck grant, which can cover a percentage of the purchase price for those that are eligible for low emissions vans and trucks. So that can kind of help with the financial side of things, which I know is a barrier for entry for quite a lot of people and businesses. And secondly, a workplace charging scheme, which is a voucher-based scheme providing financial support for businesses to install those EV charge points on their own premises. So two kind of quite useful operational examples of support available there. So moving on into kind of the business itself. Again, this is a slide that may be familiar. We've adapted it slightly from the depot version that we had in the previous forum to tailor it to those key roles that are responsible for logistics decarbonisation. Logistics sits within the kind of zero emissions vehicles theme of the 5 themes that we produced through the roadmap development. However, there is also overlap with the renewable electricity. So that's kind of why those first top 2 have been drawn out there. Because that kind of, there's lots of overlaps between the infrastructure required to support electric vehicles. So those roles really kind of need to work together. However, these efforts to decarbonise, must be championed by the wider business and all levels of seniority, but the ownership will likely sit within kind of the vehicles, the logistics managers or fleet managers, working in collaboration with those that more have oversight of the depot and the site operations as well. So to wrap up this section, we have some just kind of headline steps for a successful implementation, and these kind of summarize a lot of the points that I've made in this section. In the first forum, we discussed the creation of a kind of climate action ecosystem, and which we're starting to see in action when we look at this from the perspective of decarbonising logistics. The ecosystem concept essentially relates to like all the additional actions and support that is required to implement the initiatives that are the kind of bread and butter of decarbonisation. And it's particularly important because the subject matter is new and the technology is still relatively novel. So this slide really just outlines those strategic steps to action that's required for a wholesaler to successfully decarbonize their logistics emissions. And those 4 key steps are kind of a strategy development, and that links back to the flow chart, which is, could be a useful first step in development of that strategy. Data collection and KPIs, which was the second slide that we went through, and the data sources that identified there could be used to develop KPIs which enable kind of more tangible progress to be tracked beyond just fuel driving emissions. Thirdly, the senior endorsement and buy-in from leadership is really critical to ensure that actions that are proposed in the strategy are actually allocated and operationalized on, and to kind of unlock those resources for delivery. And then finally, collaboration with logistics partners. So I think that's the end of that section. I will hand over to Olwen unless people have questions.
Brilliant, thank you, Emily. I don't see any other questions in the chat. If there's anything else people would like to raise, please do feel free to pop a note in or just come off mute as well. We have a small enough group today. Great, so I'm now going to zoom out a bit and look at some of the kind of policy and market trends, as well as pulling out some concrete case studies from companies that are decarbonising their freight and logistics. On the policy side, I'm not going to go into too much depth here because it's maybe not the most engaging part of the presentation to go through line by line of different policies, but I think, Kat's question in the chat earlier just raised the point that a lot of the ability of a wholesaler to decarbonize their logistics is dependent on what's happening in the national policy space particularly. So we've pulled out 2 particular examples of relevant policies here. They were both implemented under the previous administration, but we do believe, like, it seems as though Labour are continuing in a similar vein, not likely to overhaul. If anything, it seems probably likely to kind of prioritise more on the kind of regional angle, which is particularly important when it comes to charging infrastructure where urban areas are already better served. So the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, this outlines really the government's plan to decarbonise the entire transport system, so not just kind of freight and logistics, also public transport and personal vehicle use. But we've pulled out a couple of the commitments that are very relevant to wholesale sector that do focus in more on freight and logistics. And for example, the second to last bullet here on maximising benefits from sustainable low carbon fuels. So to Emily's point on biofuels, how can they ensure that any biofuels that are going into decarbonised logistics aren't having that knock-on potential negative effect in other areas? And then the final one there on efficiency, because clearly that's where a lot of the win-wins take place. And if the government can help finance and fund some of the softwares or data sharing platforms that enable those efficiencies to be found, obviously that benefits the entire industry. And then there's the future of freight plans. It's a bit more narrow in its scope, and interestingly, it's quite focused on the linkages between government and sector itself. So, really looking at things like the infrastructure planning we spoke to, and delving into what the barriers are in that place so that they can be removed. And then also looking at like local planning authority collaboration as well. A couple of other policies called out on the left here too, rail freight. And we've been mainly talking about road transportation today, but of course, another way to decarbonise is to shift away from road towards rail. But of course, there needs to be the sufficient capacity in the rail network to allow that, and that's currently a big limitation. But through improvements in policy, that may improve in coming years. The industrial decarbonisation strategy, the UK hydrogen strategy, which links back to Emily's point on how it's very important to consider how hydrogen might be used across various parts of the economy, and be aware that it may not be used for particularly smaller vans or trucks as a decarbonisation lever. So on the next slide, it brings things into something a bit more tangible rather than these overarching policies, but giving a few examples of policies put into practice. So as of January last year, there's the zero emission vehicle mandate to mandate 70% of new vans and 80% of new cars to be zero emission by 2030. The idea being that this would increase to 100% of them by 2035. Then there is the investment in the infrastructure. It's a very important point, so it keeps coming up, and close to 950 million investment here for rapid charging hubs on motorways and major roads. The renewable transport fuel obligation, this is again to the biofuel point, but in cases where rather than fully switching to biofuels, doing kind of blending where you're using a mixture of biofuels and fossil-based fuels together. And then expansion, these are more of the, there can be some of the carrot policy incentives and then the stick. And these examples here of the low emission zones are obviously more of the stick, where you're hit with fees for having vehicles of a certain type as an attempt to kind of drive change. But we're aware that can cause more issues for a business rather than really a solution from a policy perspective. But I think when you're considering the cost of investing in electric vehicles, doing an analysis of what could be the fees or other taxes that you're facing should you not make that shift is important to take into account when you're calculating the return on investment. So in the next slide, then, we're just moving into more broad market trends away from the policy space specifically. When it comes to EVs, the real crux of the issue with range is to do with the ability of batteries to hold the charge, and that is advancing really, really rapidly. And as there's a bigger uptake and rollout of electric vehicles and a lot of a demand signal from the market for these moving ahead, there's more and more investment in the technology which will allow batteries to be more efficient and hold longer range. More collaborative logistics, Emily touched on this quite a lot, but often just having the right information about routes and load factors can really help to identify the low-hanging fruit of decarbonisation. And so sharing that information between the different parties involved in the logistics supply chain is crucial. The increasing availability of biofuels, we've touched on quite a bit, increasing uptake of EVs, focus on last mile delivery. I think this is interesting because it can often be the expensive and quite emissions intensive part of the supply chain, but increasingly solutions to use smaller electric vehicles and more innovative approaches are materializing there. And then the route optimization through freight platforms as well. So the next slide just goes through a few graphs. So this is a global outlook, I should say, the graph on the top right. Basically, it's showing what each year the EV outlook has been, and then how it's revised. It's been basically revised upward as a percentage of total sales of vehicles. And so the turquoise line is showing the actual, so it's tracking up close to kind of 15% by the time this data was released, which is 2022 data. And then the graph at the bottom is looking at cost. So because of the increased rollout of EVs, that helps to drive down the cost of the technology and of the price for these vehicles. And so due to this, then an analysis done in the EU looked at the expenditure, so both capex and opex. So capex in navy as part of these bar charts, and opex in red. And you can see the do nothing baseline. You have a higher opex, and that's because you're not transitioning to EV, so you have a fuel input, so the opex is higher. In the transition scenario, where we have a total cost is lower, but the split is more weighted towards the capital expenditure because that's the upfront cost of vehicles, but the operating of them is cheaper, and that's why the red section is lower. The next graph then as well is looking specifically at the UK, and it's more forecasting ahead to how transport emissions will be reduced in the UK. It's from the UK's Climate Change Committee. And the two interesting sections of the graph I draw your attention to is the orange and kind of light blue sections. So the orange one is the HGV rollout. And you can see there's very, very little to no electric HGV rollout right up until 2030, just because the technology isn't expected to be mature enough to have wide-scale rollout until then, but then it quite rapidly expands between 2030 and 2050, where we're expecting that the battery technology will be at a level that it can meet the needs of the sector. And then the other one is vans, so that's the blue part of the graph just below the orange, and you can see it's beginning quite a lot earlier. So electric vans already exist. So already now from around 2025, and it will just continue to grow at quite a steady rate out to 2050 is the expectation. Okay, so the last few slides here are just looking at some examples from actors in the broader kind of food and beverage sector and how they have worked on decarbonising their logistics. So we have Amazon, obviously an enormous company. So not all companies have the ability to invest in these kind of very advanced technologies they have, but they have brought in some fully electrified HGVs as of last month, and they expect that they will continue to add about 150 more. And so these are those HGVs I mentioned earlier in the session, which have between 300 and 500 miles range. Tesco then, this is an interesting point, a bit different, as I said, where we have mainly been talking about staying within road transport and decarbonising within that, but there's also the option to have a modal shift and look at rail. And so Tesco did a pioneer kind of rail route, which has really reduced their emissions recently. DHL have done quite a lot on the greening of their fleet. So to Emily's point earlier, when you're looking at different 3PLs, really trying to evaluate what they have already done, what plans they have in place to reduce their fleet's emissions. And then the final one here, I think, is particularly interesting because it's to this bio oil point. So this is PepsiCo using vegetable oil to reduce their emissions. And this is a great example of when it is recommended to use something like HVO as a biofuel, simply because PepsiCo are the ones here producing the fuel because it's waste vegetable oil from their own operations, and they can therefore be confident that it's truly a waste material and they aren't potentially having a knock-on impact elsewhere in terms of deforestation through palm oil being used simply to be a biofuel. So if there is a clear traceability to the source of the waste oil, that makes it a better case for using biofuel. And then the last slide of this section is just looking into the wholesale sector specifically, and a few examples of decarbonisation actions that have already been rolled out. And so we have the Cisco Climate Stripes electric vehicle. So this is a kind of small HGV vehicle that was launched coming up to 2 years ago now by Brakes. And then there's Hunts on the top right, the other photo here, which is an example of HVO diesel, so a blending between a biofuel and diesel. And they're using these very efficient engines, the Euro 6 engines, which is a standard Emily mentioned earlier. We have Harlock last year with the low emissions trucks, and they've invested about £1 million in that. And then Savona Food Service is rolling out 100% electric vehicles, and this is a dual temperature vehicle. So to Emily's earlier point, the need for refrigeration, obviously, in the wholesale supply chain is an important factor when it comes to logistics, and we'll be speaking about that a bit more in the next session. Great, so I'll pause there for a moment and see if there are any other questions or comments. Otherwise, I will just start to wrap up with some key takeaways, and if anything does spring to mind, please do just drop a note in the chat.
Hi, Owen. There's
Hi.
a couple of questions in the Q&A bit rather than the chat.
Okay. I don't have visibility of those. Let me have a look.
Kath Marsden says, any view on methodology for direct and indirect reporting of the carbon savings for downstream customers on HVO? And then Mike says, the government are investing heavily in car and van EV charging structure, which is great, but are we not seeing much coming through for HGV? I know it's linked to supply and demand. Are you aware of any imminent plans to improve this network? So that's the charging structure network for HGVs and government work in that space.
That's great. Thank you, James. So I'll just take the first one first. So this is reporting for downstream emissions, so when it's kind of outbound and not paid for by the wholesaler emissions, and HVO fuel is being used by your customers. Is that correct? I don't know if Kath is still here. I can just make sure I've understood the question correctly.
I don't know if Kath's here.
Maybe not. Unfortunately, the Q&A is not loading for me, but I'll answer that question and hopefully it's correct. Otherwise, we can take it off.
I can put it into the chat. There we go. Let's try that.
That would be great. Thank you, James. So essentially, yeah, this would fall into your scope 3 emissions. And so if you can gather information from your customers that shows the use of biofuel, say as a percentage of their total fuel used, that can be integrated into your own reporting to show a reduction in your scope 3 emissions. Yeah, so hopefully that answers the question okay, but what you would need to do is make sure you're getting the data from your customer, so that it's not a kind of shot in the dark estimate, but rather you have information on the scale of their HVO use. The other thing I would just say is, from a purely carbon accounting perspective, then that would reflect a reduction in your scope 3. It does flag up one of the limitations of GHG accounting, which is perhaps the creation of that HVO has had some knock-on impact way further upstream in the demand for palm oil, and that won't be reflected in your own emissions. And that's why there's some caution, I guess, in using it as a solution and claiming that it's a fully net zero solution. But officially, from a greenhouse gas protocol accounting standard, you can gather the data from your customer and use that to reflect a change in your scope 3. And then the other question, which is in the kind of split of investment between car and van EV, I have to say I don't know enough to say concretely there is or isn't action taking place at a HVO level. I would say the policy paper that I mentioned earlier in the call, and which I'm happy we can send as a follow-up link, does seem to look at both. So this is the one from the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles. It seems to be very much looking at it from both a personal and industrial use. So HVOs are mentioned numerous times in that policy paper. So I don't think they're being completely forgotten, but appreciate, yeah, I think the car and van rollout probably are being prioritized, and it may be just because of the technological readiness point. But I agree that's potentially a chicken and egg scenario there, where if the government funding isn't being funneled to HGVs, and the maturing of it may also be slowed. But I'll share that. I think that's a really useful paper, only released 2 months ago, so I can share that afterwards to get more into the kind of policy space. And aware of time, I'm just going to run through these couple of takeaways. So hopefully none of them come as a big surprise after the session and what Emily's been running through earlier. But just to recap, that vehicles are one of the biggest source of direct emissions. So in scope 1 for wholesalers, representing about 2/3 of aggregate scope 1 and 2 emissions across the sector. The 4 options we went through on decarbonising road logistics are looking at efficiency, switching to electric vehicles, using biofuels, or potentially hydrogen, but quite limited use cases there. We went through quite a range of the advantages and limitations of each, and hopefully the chart that we've created with the table assessing their relative performance on each will be useful. And I think the key takeaway being, there may be a need to be flexible in looking at shorter term solutions like biofuel that aren't perfect as the other technologies like electric HGVs mature. Collecting data where you can and collaborating closely with 3PLs or other value chain partners is really recommended. And we are still seeing a point to the continued acceleration of EVs across market and policy trends. And I think just reminding you of some of those grants that are already in place, look in to see your own eligibility and see if this is something you can take forward today. So that's all from us. Please do feel free to share any other questions, comments via FWD. We'll be sharing the slides, and as Lindsay said, it's been recorded so you can watch back. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Elwyn. That was really an insightful session for everyone. And I think you really nailed it at the end there when you said, there's no quick solution, no one size fits all approach when it comes to decarbonisation and logistics. this road to net zero is a journey we're very much all on together. So that's why we bring in Free Kill and run these sessions to support our members on this. So thank you to everyone for joining. A quick reminder, it will be made available shortly, so you can rewatch, revisit any points and share with colleagues as well. But enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.